Well, she's back on the podcast, and she's the writer of Why We Love Pirates and The Hunt for Captain Kidd and how we changed piracy forever. And she's also available in a new book about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, which she just told me is going to be the first biography about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, which I'm very excited about. The first book was excellent, and I highly recommend everyone to read it after you finish this episode. And please do come back and listen to the first episode she was on. I don't remember specific, but it's down there. It's somewhere in the podcast. And we're not going to go through today. We're going to talk about a very fun pirate, Stede Bonnet. And if the name sounds familiar, it's because of this new Taika waititi series, which of course is satire, but we don't need to take a look at it. How accurate is it so far from the episodes that we've seen, and we don't take out of the real life of this so-called gentleman pirate. And just the name itself, what is it about this specific pirate that makes it sound different from other pirates?
So Stede Bonnet is quite a different pirate because he wasn't really a pirate in that he had no maritime experience. He was never a sailor. He grew up in Barbados. He was the son of a very wealthy plantation owner, and he gets married. He has kids. He takes over the plantation, and then one day he up and decides he doesn't want to be a plantation owner or husband or father anymore, and he decides to become a pirate. So, but here's the thing, if you're going to be a pirate, you're stealing a ship, and, you're stealing goods, and you're dividing them up amongst the crew. What he does is he pays to have a ship built for him. He hires a crew, and then he pays the pirates wages. So even if they aren't stealing anything, they're still getting money, but this is not a practice that's normally done on pirate ships. So as a result, pirates generally don't respect him, because no self-respecting pirate is going to buy a boat, pay wages. Although his pirates didn't mind, they were getting wages. But he was incompetent. He didn't know how to sail. He didn't know how to navigate. He would make bad decisions. So he was definitely a very unique pirate in that sense.
So you would say that Taika Waititi got his characteristic fairly accurate then?
Yes. So I haven't watched all the episodes yet, but I've seen the first 3. And from what I've seen is that he's done a great job with the details, not just about Stede Bonnet, but life on the pirate ship in general, and what the culture was like, and what it would have been like when they got to Nassau, which they do, I think, in the 3rd episode. There's so much great detail that I won't lie, I was quite surprised at how impressed I was with the show.
And of course, we're going to talk more about it later, but let's start about the early life of Stede Bonnet. So what is his early life like? How do we know? Is it documented well when his life?
His early life isn't documented very well. Lots of pirates' early lives are not. So we don't know very much about his early life, except that he's from Barbados, and he was, son of a wealthy plantation owner. And he was always set from birth, basically, that he was going to inherit it at some point. He had this duty. He had to get married. He would have to have children, have to have heirs for this plantation and keep it going. So he was a very wealthy person. Growing up in Barbados, though, he would have had a lot of exposure to the sailing community because of so much trade coming in and out. And being a plantation owner, you're cultivating goods in order to sell to merchants. So he would have had a lot of this exposure no matter what, but he himself was never going to be destined to be a sailor or a merchant, even if that's what he wanted.
I believe what we were talking about in the previous episode when he first came on the podcast is that most pirates were privateers who were laid off after this. I believe the Spanish succession, wars of Spanish succession, and they became pirates when they didn't have an employer anymore. So they were quite experienced in the sea already, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. The vast majority of pirates during the time period when he was a pirate, which is about 1713 to about 1730. This is the time period, not when he was a pirate. He was a pirate from about 1717 to 1719. This is the time period where most of the really infamous pirates that we know about, such as Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, or known as Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, they were all veterans of the War of Spanish Succession. They all sailed with each other. They all fought together. And they all, even if they didn't know each other during the war, they would know of each other because they would probably have mutual acquaintances in Nassau, which was the big pirate community in the Caribbean. It's located on the island of Providence within the Bahamas. And it was known unofficially as the Pirate Kingdom because it was so frequented by pirates.
So, you know, as you know, you don't know much about his early life, but do you have a certain idea about what it was like for someone growing up in a plantation and going to take over the plantation eventually, what it was like for those kids, that we can draw a kind of similar conclusion that could be the life that he had?
Yeah, so a life knowing that you're going to be taking over a plantation is probably pretty high pressured. As a young child, he would have been educated. He would have to be educated well. So he probably had a private tutor who would educate him in all things. He would have had a private tutor that probably educated him very much in the classical or traditional style of education, which included being able to, of course, read and write and do mathematics, but he would also learn about natural philosophy. He would have studied a lot of the Greek and Roman classics. He would have studied probably logic and philosophy and theology, which is very, very standard. But also he would have been working alongside his father or the managers of the plantation, learning how to go over accounts and do calculations. And he probably had to be out in the fields quite often to learn how to supervise and understand the trade and the cultivation. So he wouldn't have had a typical childhood. Although, to be fair, most children during that time period did not have what we would think of as a typical childhood where you play and have fun. That definitely would not have been his experience. He's basically being treated like a young adult in training to take over this plantation and really take over his very high status that he was born into.
So when did it consider that they were coming of age at this point? When was marriage arranged? And usually, as was the norm in this time, when was this coming about?
It varied. So oftentimes marriages were arranged when children were quite young, especially if you were from a very kind of wealthy family. So marriages weren't, for the most part, they weren't for love. It was to unite a family, oftentimes for business or economic reasons or political reasons. In this case, of course, it probably would have been an economic reason, unite two plantation families together. So marriage for love wasn't really a factor. If you're lucky, you would learn to love your partner, or at the very least, you would like them. Usually, if these were done at a young age, you could probably be expected to get married as a teenager. Of course, once the girl, enters childbearing age after adolescence, probably somewhere between the ages of 16 and 20. In that range, I think, is when the majority of people in his social class would probably get married, probably a bit older. He would have been in his 20s and she would have been in her teens. That was very standard because he had to take the time in order to really kind of take over the plantation, or at the very least have his own property already before he could actually have his wife. So he would have been in his early 20s, maybe even mid 20s. She would have been in her mid to late teens.
Was he an intelligent person in a sense, not necessarily by sea, but on land at least? Was he somewhat intelligent there in the management? In, like you said, he was reading Greek and Roman classics. Was he an intelligent person?
He was, yes. He was a very intelligent, very intellectual person. He was very well read. He was known to read, all the classics. He loved kind of reading about a lot of adventures, especially from the classical world, because that's where he was educated in. And if you read Greek and Roman classics, there are loads of tales about, things that happen at sea. A lot of the mythology takes place at sea. So
as we know in Odyssey, most of the stuff, a lot of the book takes place in sea.
Yeah, a lot of them would. But he was very well read and he loved to read. He was known on his ship to have a very large library, which is also really unusual for a pirate captain.
Which is portrayed in the show as well.
It is. This is a detail I was very impressed with. They show him in his cabin with a whole bunch with walls, floor to ceiling walls of books. And this is what Stede Bonnet had in his ship.
So how is it a happy marriage that he's married into? Because in the show, I don't know if you've gotten this far, I don't remember the episode, but it doesn't seem to be a very happy marriage in as the show portrays. And was it like that in real life, that it was a miserable marriage, to say the least?
We don't really quite know how his marriage was. In general, hopefully the marriage would have been cordial. Hopefully they would have been kind to each other. Sometimes, these marriages, of course, would not go well. They might not be a good match. There could be, it could be that the only relationship they had would just simply be to bear children, and that was it. And then once the wife had, a suitable amount of kids that survived childhood, then their physical relation might stop. In terms of Stede Bonnet, we don't really know what his marriage was like, but according to Captain Charles Johnson, who wrote the book A General History of the Pirates, it said that he was dissatisfied, and he sort of took, I'm paraphrasing here, but he had kind of what Charles Johnson sort of referred to, trouble in his mind, that made him one day decide to change his mind, and we can't explain why. And today, today we might refer to that as a midlife crisis, honestly. Yes.
So how does he go about building a ship? Does he do it in secret from his wife? Is it suddenly like, I'm going to become a pirate and I'm going to first build my ship and then I'm going to set the sail? Or does he just buy a ship then and there? Or how does he go about doing that?
He goes about to, I think he goes to the main city in Barbados, which I believe is Bridgetown. And what he would have done is he would have hired a carpenter or a shipwright. And these are the people who build ships. And he would have paid them to build him a really large ship because he's very wealthy. He can afford it. And while the ship is being built, he's probably recruiting sailors in local taverns, because that is where sailors went while they were on land having a break, and also to find out information for a new sailing job in case the one they had was over. So this is where he'd go, and he'd recruit people, and probably was like, we're not going to work for anybody. We're going to work for ourselves. We're basically going to be pirates. We're going to have adventures. We're going to get rich. I'm going to pay you all a salary, and I'm going to pay you all very well. I have a ship being built. And so a lot of people probably would have looked at him like, okay, this guy doesn't really know what he's doing. A sailor can tell right away if you don't have any proper sailing experience. So a lot of them knew that this could be quite risky, but at the same time, they're like, okay, well, it looks like we will be getting some job security. So that's why he was able to get pirates to sign, or sailors to sign on with him to become pirates. As for the ship is being built. It's very large, and he names it the Revenge. So to try to give it like a big piratey name.
So how does his first year or a few months go as a pirate when he's first set to sail? Is it what he expect, or is it does it do any raids at all?
It's not quite what he expects. So initially they don't have very many successes. He doesn't really quite know which ships to go after, and he doesn't really have much experience attacking. So this is left to his sailors to kind of sort of take over this role. So like kind of the first several months, they don't have very much luck until they finally come upon a large Spanish galleon, which he insists that they have to attack. But actually a lot of his crew don't really support this very much because they're not quite sure if they could take on a large Spanish galleon. But they do. Stede Bonnet insists, and sure enough, there isn't really a winner or a loser in this. The pirates don't really get much, but instead their ship gets very heavily damaged in the battle against the Spanish. And Stede Bonnet himself is severely injured in this battle, severely injured in the leg. And it's very possible he almost didn't survive the injury. It left him lame for the rest of his life. That's how bad the injury was. And from there, they decide to head on to Nassau, which has become known as kind of the place where pirates go. It would be a place to repair the ship. It would be a place to, replenish their goods and sort of figure things out, maybe join up with other pirates. That's kind of how the first year for the most part went.
So talk about the time in Nassau. What did they do when they first arrive at Nassau? Do we have an account of that?
We don't have very many details about what he did in Nassau, but what we do know is that is where he met Edward Teach, who would become known popularly as Blackbeard. And Edward Teach surprisingly decides to team up with Stede Bonnet. Now, Edward Teach's career is complete opposite. He was a veteran of the War of Spanish Succession. He was the quartermaster for Benjamin Hornigold. So he was kind of Benjamin Hornigold's number 2 right-hand man protege. So he had loads of experience and he was trained up by a brilliant captain. And to the point where when Hornigold retired, he gave Blackbeard his own ship, and Blackbeard was able to become a pirate on his own after the war ended. And he already had a pretty good reputation. And when I say pretty good, I mean popular reputation as being
pretty
quite
bad for the British.
Right, yeah. And, he would sail up and down the eastern seaboard of North America, and he would plunder loads of ships, and so he decided to team up with Stede Bonnet, mostly because Stede Bonnet is extremely wealthy. And this is why Stede Bonnet is known as the gentleman pirate, because he dressed in the finest clothes possible and he was very educated.
When does I wanted to ask about that. So, well, as you mentioned, when does it get the reputation as the gentleman pirate? Does he invent the term himself, or is it people who...
I don't know when the term would have been referred to. I think he's referred to that in Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, but I'm not sure if Johnson came up with that term himself or if that's how he was colloquially known. But that, of course, is how we refer to him. It's possible that people called him the gentleman pirate, and I don't think it would have been a compliment. It probably would have been a bit of like a backhanded compliment, maybe to his face, but it was really meant to be kind of an insult. But Blackbeard sees a good opportunity, though, because he sees that Bonnet is very wealthy. And, with the repairs, Bonnet does have a very good ship. It's very large, and he has a substantial crew. And with this, Blackbeard knows he can create a small fleet of his own. And he knows that Stede Bonnet, being kind of incompetent, he could be, it could be easy for Blackbeard to take a lot of control away from him, which is what he does.
He was able to use Stede Bonnet to try to get control himself, in other words.
Right, exactly. So basically what he kind of does is, he tells Stede Bonnet, I'm in charge, I'm the captain of this fleet, but you can still be in charge of your own ship. But what happened is that Stede Bonnet was sort of captain just in title only. All of his, respect and authority as a captain kind of went away because a lot of his crew actually preferred to sail with Blackbeard. So a lot of his crew sort of jumped ship and went on to Blackbeard's ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge. So, Stede Bonnet wasn't very satisfied with this arrangement because he didn't feel he was being respected. He felt that Blackbeard was taking his crew away from him and he was stripped of a lot of his own authority, but there wasn't anything he could do. So, because Blackbeard had so much control.
So what does he do then? What is his options? What is it trying to? Does it try to leave Blackbeard and
no?
Does he realize that he kind of need Blackbeard as well?
He does. He needs Blackbeard because, again, Stede Bonnet, he has his injury, so he's not exactly like in the best physical condition. He has a lot of his own wealth, so he's able to kind of help finance a lot of what they're doing. So in that way, he manages to play a pretty good role in what he's doing. But he doesn't really have any place to go. He knows that because so much of his crew is more loyal to Blackbeard, that he couldn't leave the fleet anyways, because he wouldn't have enough people sailing with him to command his ship. And he also at this point knows that he can't attack any ships on his own. And he's going to need someone who's going to be more experienced with another powerful ship. So no, he's kind of really sort of stuck in this situation. He isn't happy about it, but it's better than the alternative.
And again, I'm gonna refer a lot to the show here. So in the show you see them kind of become friends-ish, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Do they become friends in real life as well, or is that more fiction?
Initially they are, yes. And, like I said, Blackbeard sees a really good opportunity with Stede Bonnet. So he wants, them to have mutual respect and get along. And he likes that Stede Bonnet has a lot of resources and the ship. So initially, yes, that they were friends. But as time went on, when Blackbeard realized how incompetent Bonnet really was as a sailor and as a pirate, Blackbeard's opinion of him dropped very, very quickly. To the point where Blackbeard wasn't going to want to work with Stede Bonnet anymore.
So does he try to train him as innocence, or does he try to make him become a competent sailor from being incompetent?
Yeah, so what he does finally is so here's the problem. They have been raiding a lot of ships, and this is about 1718, I think. Blackbeard has realized that they've become too recognizable with, the Queen Anne's Revenge is very large. He's become associated with it. He's sailing with another ship, also with someone who just doesn't really know what he's doing. And Blackbeard feels like he's more of a hindrance than a help. So what Blackbeard decides to do is they kind of go onto the coast of North Carolina, off the coast of Ocracoke, which is kind of an island off the coast of North Carolina. They've just had some pretty good wins. They've robbed some ships. They were successful. And so Blackbeard kind of says like, hey, let's celebrate. And so a lot of the pirates, including Stede Bonnet, they get rip-roaringly drunk as they're drinking all the wine and alcohol that they have stolen. And in the meantime, Blackbeard has actually come up with a plan between him and 40 of his favorite pirates. And what they do is Blackbeard goes inland because he heard that the governor of North Carolina was offering a pardon to any pirate who turned themselves in and named any accomplices. So Blackbeard decides to take a pardon because he needs to lie low, then he won't be charged for his crimes. And what he does is he betrays Stede Bonnet. And so Blackbeard and his 40 fellow pirates that he's chosen go inland. And in the meantime, Stede Bonnet and the rest of the pirates wake up on the beach to find themselves all arrested. So it was a huge betrayal.
Actually, I want to ask and go back a little bit because I'm curious about it. Was it kind of normal that people like Stede Bonnet or any kind of middle or lower class would kind of run away from the family to start a life at sea, how a better life for themselves necessarily? Was it that uncommon, or was Stede an exception?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting because it's kind of a case-by-case basis. A lot of pirates did have families, and it could have been assumed that Stede Bonnet was doing what a lot of pirates did, going at sea for a certain period of time and planned to go home quite wealthy, because that is what a lot of pirates did. They would go, they'd be a pirate for about a year or two maybe, and then if they survived it, they would go home pretty, if not wealthy, they would come home very comfortable financially to really help out their family. Now, Stede Bonnet, being someone who abandoned his family as a plantation owner, I can't say how people would have reacted to this, but I imagine that there would have been a lot of people, including his crew, who wouldn't understand why he was giving up such a wealthy, respected, and to them, easy life. Because the vast majority of pirates who had initially been sailors came from very poor and working class backgrounds where they didn't really have other opportunities besides going to sea, which they did at a young age, until they might turn pirate for various reasons. So many probably would have been quite confused as to why he made this decision. And it possibly could have been a reason why maybe they wouldn't fully respect him. What person might want to leave that? He's too soft. He doesn't know hard work. He's never really had to work at sea. So I think it would have been quite mixed here.
So, okay, let's go back to the pardon. And do Blackbeard get to keep the goods that is stole, or is that confiscated when he takes the pardon?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, does Blackbeard get to keep the goods that is stole when he gets the pardon, or does he have to, is that confiscated when?
Oh, so no, Blackbeard is able to keep his goods. This is one of the conditions of the pardon, is that if they turn themselves in and name their accomplices, then they're able to keep their goods. Now, not all pirates were lucky to actually have this happen. Sometimes their goods were confiscated anywhere, but it appears that Blackbeard was allowed to keep his goods because he gave up such a huge number of pirates, including another pirate captain. So Blackbeard would have been able to keep his goods.
So he ratted enough people out, you would be able to keep the goods anyway.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was because it was seen, it was worth it to them.
So there wasn't a moral code like in a mafiosi that if you ratted out, you were kind of a dead man, or it wasn't like that in the pirate times.
A lot of pirates, it's interesting because it's a good question. A lot of pirates wouldn't rat each other out because of loyalty to each other, but at the same time, there were a lot of pirates who did take a pardon, and the reason for this is because it could be hard being a pirate. At some point, a lot of pirates might realize that their life was unsustainable and they knew that they could be in danger at any point and probably wouldn't survive. And if they were able to take a pardon, then it's like getting a clean slate and they could all, have their records erased and start over and get more legitimate work, maybe as a privateer or something like that. Or some would become pirate hunters. But what's interesting is about
That's what
half
happened to
of
Hornigold, right? He became a pirate hunter in the end.
who did?
Hornigold?
Yes, yeah. Benjamin Hornigold actually did become a pirate hunter, which was quite interesting. A lot of people didn't really expect that. But he wasn't a pirate hunter for very long because Benjamin Hornigold was killed, I think possibly in a storm. We're not too sure. But yes, he did become a pirate hunter. And there were lots of privateers who became pirate hunters as well. But what's interesting is that about half of all pirates who took a pardon would go back into piracy at some point.
Was there a second chance to get a pardon that one, or was it like if you go back there's no pardon again, you're gonna get hanged if you get caught?
I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty certain based on the research I've done and what I read that if a pirate ended up breaking the terms of their pardon, that they would not get a second chance, because if they did that once, they're definitely going to do that again.
So what happens to Stede Bonnet when he's found? We went a little bit astray there, but what happened to Stede Bonnet when he is waking up and he's found surrounded by the British Army?
So Stede Bonnet is arrested, just like everybody else, and somehow Stede Bonnet manages to escape. He manages to escape prison. We're not quite sure how, but he does it. And when
I thought you said that didn't happen in the last episode, that people hardly ever escape prison when. I thought you said there was
it's
really any
rare.
record.
That's why it's rare, and that's why it's interesting that Stede Bonnet managed to do this. So we don't know how. Maybe he bribed some guards. This is what Bonnet did when he was arrested. He'd be very much like, hey, I'm wealthy, I'm educated, I'm a plantation owner, I'd never do this again. I come from a very well-respected background, and sometimes, hoping that could work in his favor. But he was still in prison, but we're not sure how, but he did manage to escape. He probably had help. But what we do know is that he escaped and he actually went back into pirating. He became a pirate again.
I actually want to ask this before we move on. And I kind of want to draw to the mafiosi again with this, because as we know, at least in the movies, the mafiosi had a better life in jail. Was this the same for wealthy plantation owners? If they were arrested, that they did have, like Stede Bonnet, they should have a better life in jail even when they get arrested because of their wealth and their connections?
Yes, they would have a better time in jail because they could afford it. In prison, if you wanted better food, if you wanted alcohol, if you wanted extra provisions, such as maybe some extra clothes or blankets or something, you or your family had to be able to pay for it. And most of the time, a lot of people who were put into prison probably couldn't afford most of that. Whereas if you were wealthy, well, one, if you were very wealthy, it was very rare for you to go to prison in the first place. If they were able to, someone like Stede Bonnet would have been able to afford anything he wanted. He probably could have gotten his own cell on his own. He would have been allowed to be able to purchase clothing and anything he wanted. He probably could have even had some of his own books with him. Being very wealthy, he would have had a much nicer time in prison, as nice as you can ever have in prison. But it's him being arrested as someone very wealthy coming from a high status background. That was very much the exception to the rule. But pirates were generally not given any leniency. So that's why he was still imprisoned anyways, but he would have been able to afford to have some of these extra privileges.
So what happened to the revenge when he got caught? Was it confiscated, or did they destroy the revenge, or does it get it back?
I'm actually not sure what happened to the revenge. He did not get it back. So it was most likely confiscated and probably sold to somebody, or maybe it was dismantled and they sold the parts to other shipwrights.
We don't have any archaeological evidence or anything from the revenge today.
Yeah, it wasn't shipwrecked. We do know that. It didn't crash, it didn't sink. So we don't really have any archaeological digs for it.
So So with this even misbehaving, how does it go? Does it try to find some crew, or are they hanged, or does it go about finding a new crew? And another thing I wanted to know is, as he knows that he's quite wealthy, so how does it get his fortune? Does it have it on the ship, or does it just kind of draw bright checks? How did that work back in the day when he just abandoned the plantation?
Um,
How does he manage to keep his fortune and be able to pay the sailors?
he would have brought money with him. He would have brought money with him either in cash or in the form of some sort of banknote. Most likely he would have brought it in cash. And I feel like, from what I remember, I think we even see that in one of the first episodes, that he has cash on hand, unless that's a false memory. But he would have had the cash on him. He probably emptied some bank accounts. I think there's some idea that he left his wife in a pretty bad situation because he took so much money with him. But we don't know what happened to his family. There's no
husband of the year.
Yeah.
So, like we said, how does it go on about getting a new crew? Is the old crew hanged at this point?
There are members of his crew that were hanged, and then there were some that were hanged later. Now, Bonnet himself, we're not even quite positive, but he managed to join another crew. I think he may have even become captain again, because he'd been a captain once before. But he's not, and he even manages to attack another couple of ships, but he's not successful for long. He's eventually going to get arrested off the coast of South Carolina and put in prison there. And while he's in prison in South Carolina, he actually writes directly to the governor. He's writing letters to the governor saying, hey, I'm a very wealthy, respected gentleman in Barbados. There will be people who speak for me. I'm very high status. He was kind of counting on his high status as a plantation owner to prevent him from being executed, but it didn't work. The governor didn't answer his letters or anything like that. So Stede Bonnet would be hanged in South Carolina.
But before, I want to talk a little bit more about his return to sea. Does he get more respect now that he has somewhat experience of piracy, or is he still not respected?
I don't think he would have had the same amount of respect as other pirates would. He probably had a reputation. It's a small community. People talk. People would have learned about him at Nassau. But I think the idea, though, that he managed to escape prison probably did gain him some respect. Like, look what he was able to do. But again, he managed to, I'm not positive if he became captain again, but he was at the very least able to have a high position. I'm pretty certain, just because the way he was executed and how famous he was, that he was made a captain again, or at the very least, he still had the title because he'd been captain before. So he would have been known. As for whether or not he was respected, I am honestly not really sure.
Do the other pirates consider him a coward? They kind of hinted at this, but when he's arrested and then he managed to escape, that they think he bribed himself. Do they have not grudge, but do they kind of consider him a coward for this?
I can only speculate because we don't know how the other pirates are feeling, but what I imagine is they probably did not like the fact that he was trying to bribe his way out of his punishment and trying to get special treatment. Nobody really likes it when someone thinks they can get special treatment. So I'm pretty certain that people felt very similarly towards Bonnet. And in the end, it's proven Bonnet was no better than anybody else. He still got treated the same, and he was still executed with other pirates. So he didn't even get his own singular execution. He had a trial, just like all other pirates did. It was very publicized. It was published. It's a very detailed trial that actually tells us a lot about what pirates are like. So, he did get kind of special attention for that. And that is, again, because of his wealth and how unusual it was for someone like him to become a pirate.
Is it because of the trial that he becomes so famous that he is? Or really?
Yeah, it's two things. It's one, it's the fact that he sailed with Blackbeard, who was a very famous pirate already. And then because of his pirate trial because of how detailed it was. And it was published cheaply and it was very widely circulated.
Does he hold a grudge against Blackbeard for abandoning him and betraying him?
Yeah, probably. I think Stede Bonnet was very, very upset about that. No one wants to be betrayed. And I think he absolutely was probably furious and shocked. And, who knows? He would have been all of these things.
So let's talk about the trial. As you mentioned, it's quite detailed. So they can go into the trial. How long does it last? Where is it in London? Is it in the Caribbean?
It's in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was captured and put into prison, or just off the coast, South Carolina. It was in Charleston. The trial itself, I believe, only lasted for a few days. Pirate trials generally didn't last that long. They weren't a long, drawn-out process. They were mostly kind of a formality because pirates were assumed guilty when they came into court. So he was already presumed guilty. And so a lot of it, again, it was just for show because legally everybody deserved, everyone was supposed to get a trial. To try to defend themselves. But so that's what Bonnet would have had. But the trial itself didn't last long, just a few days.
Can he afford a decent lawyer at this point in time, or was he bankrupt
Usually, people didn't really hire their lawyers at the time. They were usually people who already worked for the court. And they would be there to represent. But for the most part, a lot of pirates, a lot of criminals and pirates, they had to represent themselves for the most part. So they didn't really get defense lawyers at the time. There might be some lawyers who might help them and speak for them a little bit, but in general, people, especially pirates, they had to really speak for themselves.
And it was a case with Stede Bonnet as well. There was no exception.
Yeah, no exception.
So does he get hanged?
He was being treated like any other pirate.
So would it get hanged relatively quickly, or was it that kind of death like that throughout the day that it was so many years of waiting until, or is it like the second day you're found guilty, you're hanged? Or
generally, for the most part, in British law, which was put in place in the Caribbean and in North America when they had to kind of implement British criminal law. Generally, I believe if someone was going to be executed, if they were sentenced to that, it had to be done within 28 days. But if you were a pirate, it had to be done within 10 days. So the execution would have happened pretty quickly after that.
So on a scale from 1 ARG to 10 ARGs, how would you rate Stede Bonnet's career and legacy?
Tell me
from 1 ARG to 10 ARGs.
Oh, 1 ARG to 10 ARG. Okay. So in terms of like his ability as a pirate, I would give him a 5. And I'm being a bit generous because, it takes guts just to be a pirate. And the fact he was able to sail with Blackbeard and manage to escape prison, I give him props for that. So as a pirate, 5 ARGs. In terms of his legacy, I would probably give him, initially beforehand, I would have given him maybe like a 7 or an 8 because he was really only famous because he sailed with Blackbeard. But with the show now, depending on how popular it becomes, that'll raise his profile. But what's interesting is a lot of people ask, like, have asked me, have you heard of the show? It's about a pirate. I'm like, yeah, Stede Bonnet. And they're like, is he a real pirate? And I'm like, and I say, yes, he is a real pirate. And a lot of people are surprised. So I don't think as many people know who Stede Bonnet was as we think. So in terms of ARG for him, I would probably give him a 7.
I actually had to look it up because I wasn't even sure myself when I found out, and I was quite surprised that it was actually a real person. So I was like, I'd rather make an episode about this guy.
Yeah, it's really fun. And if people want to read more about Stede Bonnet, there's a book I can recommend. I think it's called The Life and Trials of the Gentleman Pirate, and it's by Jeremy Moss, who wrote a book about Stede Bonnet. So that would be a good book for people to read if they want to learn more.
I was actually going to ask, but you kind of already answered it. But as we've seen in the show, it was he does have a biographer with him, and he's sort of historian. Yeah. Did he have that in real life as well? Did he have something to write?
No, they didn't. That's something I found really funny because the person writing about him, I remember kind of thinking, oh, he's probably based on Captain Charles Johnson, who wrote A General History of the Pirates. So I found that to be quite funny. And I feel like in terms of how they're trying to understand Stede Bonnet's character, who wants to be seen as respected and everything, it's funny. And I'm like, yeah, for the show, I believe that he would have someone do that. But he wouldn't, that wouldn't have happened in real life. Pirates did not keep records, or if they did keep records, they were usually destroyed.
So, of course, we got asked, what would you rate the show that you've seen so far, and what can we expect to see in the show in the future? Spoiler alert! If you don't want to know what happens in real life on the show.
So I really enjoy the show, and as a pirate historian, I've been telling people, like, yes, definitely watch it. It's funny, it's silly. It's not all that correct all the time. They dramatize things and make things funny for the show, but it's they get lots of details about pirate life that I think is really interesting. They even have a woman disguised as a man on the ship.
You think that's kind of a reference to Mary Ann, as she did kind of the same?
It's possible that it could be a reference to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, but what I like to think is that this is someone who represents the fact that there were probably a lot more women disguised as men on pirate ships than we think, than we know. They wouldn't have been, either if they weren't found out, then it wouldn't have been recorded. So I really like that detail. I like the detail of how diverse the ship is, because all pirate ships were extremely diverse. And so what we come to expect is, he's going to be teaming up with Blackbeard, and I think we're going to be seeing all the major challenges and upsets he's going to have once he's with Blackbeard, kind of starting to see his reputation get usurped or his position getting usurped. There's going to be a bit of a struggle of a power balance, I think.
I think the crew will abandon him in the series as well. No,
I think they're going to abandon him. I think, probably because it's such a big deal that they end up going for Blackbeard. I think it even shows. So sorry, the leaf blowers are here now. I think, they've already shown in the show in the very first episode that there are a lot of members of the crew who are pretty dissatisfied with what he's doing anyways. And some people are even like,
sorry about that.
Sorry, give me a second.
That's sorry. I'd rather put this recording on pause just 5 seconds. Yeah, so in terms of the show, what would you rate the show?
I would give the show probably like an 8 out of 10. And I give it such a high score because, one, it's really fun and it's well written. And I also really enjoy all the little details that they get correct in terms of how a pirate ship operates. I feel like they understand what the character of Stede Bonnet should be like. And of course, things are dramatized for the show, and they do get some things wrong here and there, which of course you're going to do in any show, which is why I'm taking off a couple of points. But overall, I think it's fun, and I would recommend it to anyone, even if, whether or not you're interested in pirates, it's a fun show. And, the star of the show, Rhys Davies, who plays Stede Bonnet, was on the show Flight of the Conchords, and that has quite a cult following. As we know, Taika Waititi, who created the show and plays Blackbeard in the show, also has a very large following. So at the very least, if people don't know that they're involved in the show, hopefully now they do, and they'll be interested. So
and hopefully they find this episode eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you back, and you're always welcome. Back into the show anytime. And something I understand that we talked about, that you get a new book published, and when will it be available? Because like we talked about before the recording, it is earlier in the UK than the US because it's a UK publisher. So when is it available in both UK, US/Europe or US?
So I've got a new book coming out. It's called Pirate Queens, The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, about the real life female pirates who sailed together. It's a full-length biography, and I believe it's probably the first full-length biography about them. It comes out in the UK and Europe on the 21st of April. And in the United States, it will come out on the 7th of July.
And will it be different or similar to the first book? Because it was.
It'll be quite different. It's quite different. It's being published by the publisher called Pen and Sword, and they focus on specifically publishing history. So my first book, was meant to be a fun, a very well researched, but a fun, very light, kind of funny read. This one is a bit more traditional. So I do take I do like to have a little fun when I write. So there are lots of parts where it's very narrative, but it's a bit more serious in tone, but it's still very readable.
When is it available to be pre-order your new book, and what time can people purchase them? Where can people find the book if they wish to?
It's already available for pre-order. You can go on Amazon, or you can go directly to the Pen and Sword website and buy it directly from there. It's available for pre-order in the UK, Europe, and also in the United States right now for hardcover.
Thank you so much for coming. And do you have any social media or any links you wish me to put in the description where people can find you?
Yes, I have a website, which is rebecca-simon.com, and you can find me on Twitter and you can find me on TikTok. So on Twitter, my username is Beckalex, Beckalex. And on TikTok, where I do daily pirate facts, it's Pirate Beckalex, one word.
Definitely recommend to follow on both and on Instagram as well.
Oh yes, Instagram is the same as my TikTok handle, Pirate Beckalex, but I don't really do much professional piratey stuff on there.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you on. My name is Erlend. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available usually every Thursday. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you can find our podcast. I would just like to say that our YouTube account just reached 69 subscribers. Very nice.
Excellent.
So please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe. My name's Alan. I'll see you next week.